Hello guys, welcome to my video and... oh wait, this is the end.
Hello, welcome to my video, and now I'm going to show you the endgame between Vladislav Artemiev and Magnus Carlsen from Airthings Masters. White has slightly worse structure, but also you have to have in mind that although white has slightly weaker pawn structure, it's still a very reduced material, so it gives white good drawing chances. White was to move, and here he chose to play a move e4, giving up this pawn, which was not necessary to play for white. He could have gone with bishop f4 and just continue his usual play. If knight e6, then bishop g3, and if bishop f6, king goes to d3, and he'll be able to push e4 without having to give up the pawn. But Artemiev somehow chose to force things by pushing e4 in this position. He gave the pawn up. After this knight e4, and it was a very interesting moment. Does white take on e4 or not? Artemiev chose to not capture on e4, he chose to play bishop f4. But if he chose to capture, at first you might think that black has some options like bishop f6 or bishop e5, just trying to kick this bishop from g3 to enter with his king and to capture the pawn on h4. But things are not so simple as they seem. White can play bishop d6. Here, in case of king f2, to somehow get closer to the pawn, now black has bishop e5 and he exchanges the bishops. If takes, king f3, king f5, king g3, and now king e4 should be played. And how does white continue here? If he goes for king g4, there is h5. And after king g5, then black's king just enters from behind. And if king g6, then king g4, capture the pawn, and there's no way that white can be in time after this. Now the h-pawn is running without any interference. Also here, if you go with h5 with some idea to keep an opposition like this, then black goes with king e5. And now if king g3, then king f5. In case of king f3, then g4 and king g5, losing the h5 pawn. And in case of king h3, to somehow try to trick by playing this and getting this famous stalemate, black doesn't have to answer like this. He can just go king f4 and enter to g4, take the h5 pawn and finish the game. So the only option here, I think, after king g4, king e5, is to play this move. But now there is king d4, and now black is waiting for white to make a move. For example, if king g3, then king e3, getting the opposition, and now, in case of this, king f4, and king h3 is now not enough because of g4. And now king h4 would just lead to g3 and slowly pushing this pawn. So after this, if you go to g4, then king e4 with the same outcome. After this, there's king f5 and we get the position similar to one before this one. If king h3, then king f4 with entering with the king to g4. Or if king f3, then just g4 and black is winning the h5 pawn. So exchanging bishops in this case would be fatal. So king f2 is bad in this case. Bishop d6 is, because of that reason, the best move to somehow avoid getting his bishop passive. And now bishop e5, which would be very nice, because now white cannot afford exchanging bishops because of all the previously mentioned variations. But something I forgot to mention before is that the bishop on e5 is of the wrong color, of the opposite color of the corner, and white just has to exchange this pawn and this pawn. Then he can even give up the bishop, and it's all good for white. It's a draw if somehow white gets to do that, to take the g-pawn in exchange for, let's say, h-pawn or the bishop. So that's why he can play a move h5. And if bishop d6, then just take on g6, and black is left with his h-pawn, which is useless when the bishop is dark squared. If the bishop was light squared, then it's a different story, but in this case it doesn't work. And also if h5 g5, there's bishop f8 winning the h6 pawn, and here I think after this bishop h6, bishop d4 can be quite dangerous.
But white can actually play bishop g5 here and stop the g pawn. Let's say if g3, bishop h4, g2, and there's bishop f2, and the bishop holds the g1 square, and also the h pawn is going to be used as a decoy for either the bishop or the king, and in that case the king can also enter to f3, or once the bishop goes to g1 it can go to f2 and pick up the g2 pawn, which means that it's a clear draw. So on bishop d6 I think the best try for black to play for a win is to go bishop d4, to somehow try to push the g pawn and to box the king. In case of king f1, to go king f3 and then to push the g pawn. Let's say if white tries the same with h5, then g5 is possible, and if bishop f8, now the greediness doesn't help because now the g pawn cannot be stopped. Black didn't lose the time with bishop e5, bishop d4 like in the previous case. Now on king f1 there's king f3 and the g pawn queens on the next move. So that's the difference between bishop e5 and bishop d4. In the bishop e5 variation, black had to play additionally bishop d4, and that gave time for white to get this maneuver. But in this case, black played bishop d4 immediately and the g pawn was just too fast. But after bishop d4, h5, g5, bishop f8, g4, and now white can play bishop b4, just go back, and I think this should be a draw actually. As white, you want to go bishop d2 next, and if black tries g3, there's bishop e1, and now this line doesn't work, the g pawn gets under control, and I think this is holdable for white, because now of course this is a draw, since black's bishop is on the wrong color. Even if black takes the h-pawn, it's draw. So after bishop e1, king f4, you can play that, but you can take and get to f1. White will manage to make a draw. So Artemiev had a really tough choice to make. Does he want to exchange or not? And it wasn't so trivial to assess this. So he went for bishop f4 here, trying to put pressure on h6 and to make the bishop less active. That's why Magnus plays h5, trying to free his bishop. Now king f3, and now he's okay with exchanging bishops. The king is closer to the pawn. That's why Magnus plays knight c5, and now we have a couple of moves. Black tries to improve his knight, gets to f7, and now bishop f4. Bishop f6 and bishop b8. And now Magnus makes first threat in the position, knight h6, to get to f5 and to hit the h4 pawn. And that's why king h3 was played, to make space for the bishop on g3. Now the king gets more active by king d4, and now closer and closer, king gets to f4. The only issue for black in this position is the g6 pawn. If it could somehow be protected at all times, to not include the knight and the bishop, he would have easier time to make a progress. But with the g6 weakness, he always has to be careful about some potential knight jumps. At the moment, he's covering everything so nicely. f8 is so far from white's knight, so everything is okay so far. Knight c4, king f3, and now bishop e1. The bishop has to stay on this diagonal to defend the h4 pawn. Bishop d4 now, trying to limit the knight to not get any jumps. Bishop d2, and now knight g3. Now there is also potential of some checkmating pictures, like knight e2, bishop e5 at some point, knight g1. That's one potential mating picture, but at the moment doesn't work because of knight on c4. Bishop g5, and now knight f5. Knight d2, and now king e2. So white is successfully defending this one. Bishop e5, knight c5, and now king goes to f3. This king on h3 looks very scary because it might get under some mating attack.
it's enough to just put the knight on g1 at this moment and give a checkmate. Knight e6 and now knight g3, with the idea of knight e2 and knight g1 next. Bishop d8 by white, and after knight e2 to get the checkmate, now there's this check, king f4 and knight f7. Now the knight gets closer, gets into the black's camp, and always tries some knight h8, so the bishop has to stay on the long diagonal to keep an eye on h8. King f5 by black, and now king g2. Actually here black could have taken on e5 and after this to go bishop g5. Now the point is not to allow the king to get to f3 in any way. That's why bishop g5 was played, because once the king gets to f4 he can get to f3 and it's game over, because in that case the knight will just jump to f4, force the king to be more passive, and then get to g4, which is the key square for the king. And then he just reroutes the knight, attacks the pawn on h4, and it's game over. So that's why the bishop has to defend f4, and also it's very important to, in case of some king e4 move, to go king g2 to avoid king f3. If black occupies f3, he will occupy even g4 and then take the h4 pawn. And in case of this, to go back to h3. But he chose to play this to keep pieces on the board. Bishop f4 and now king h3. Knight goes to d4. Bishop g5, and now probably trying to transfer into some other endgame, seeing that Artemiev was defending this one pretty nicely. He wanted to reset the counter of 50 moves by exchanging the bishops, and after knight g5 now we have the knight endgame. King f4 now and knight f7 by white. In case of knight h7, that would be a huge mistake, because in that case knight e6 is very strong, followed by king f3 with knight f4 and eventually capturing the g4 square. For example, if you try this one, king f3, and now white is in Zugzwang, because if he goes to h2, knight f4 comes, and now either the king moves, which allows the king to enter and grab the pawn on h4, or the knight allows by moving to h7 and allowing this king g4. So Artemiev chose wisely, and he played knight f7, knight c6 by Magnus, and now it's a critical moment in the game. Here Artemiev plays knight g5, which seems quite natural, just putting the knight on some square, but actually d6 was better, and after king f3 white has knight f7 and the g6 pawn becomes a huge target. The king is too far away, and now actually it's black who is in Zugzwang, because he cannot move his knight since there is this check and black has to step away, but it doesn't change too much. The game continues. But in the game this was played, and the issue with this move is that after a nice move which Magnus found, the knight becomes stranded. Its route becomes really clumsy, and it doesn't allow the king to keep an eye on this h4 pawn anymore. And the move is knight d8. Now it completely cuts off the knight, and we have the case of Zugzwang, because if white goes to h7 there is knight e6, and in case of this, king f3 followed by knight f4 and entering to g4. In case of king h2, like in the previous case, knight f4, then king g4 next, or king g3. Depends on what white does. Artemiev chose to move the king to g2, and now the king gets more active and the h4 pawn becomes a huge target. Knight f3 and now knight f7 to stop knight e5. King f2 and now king f4 first, to make the knight free, because the threat was knight e5 next. For example, if knight h6, then just give a check, king f5, and then even knight d3 works. And white has good chances to survive this. So king f4 was more prophylactic move to stop knight e5, and also to make the king less active. It went back to g2. Now knight d6, now when white doesn't have knight e5, king f2, and now knight c4. And now he's trying to get back to g4 without allowing knight e5. Also possible was knight f5, but I believe that this is much more precise, knight c4, because it doesn't leave any hint of a counterplay to white. King g2 by white, and now king g4 back, king f2. And now the king enters deeply into the position, king h3, which will finally leave white without option to defend this pawn on h4. He went back to f1, and now one check, king f2, and now knight g4, again defending against knight e5 move, and also not allowing king e3. King e1, king g2, and now if king e2, there's king g3, just leaving white in complete zugzwang. That means that white's losing the h-pawn. So that's why he chose to play knight g5, but after this, finally he's losing the h-pawn. And after knight e4, the only issue is after g5 that the king is a bit stuck. Artemiev tries this, knight e5, and now king g2. White makes some formation, some defensive formation. Black is 2 pawns up, but he has issues with his king. His king cannot move from g4 because that just doesn't make any progress. So that's why Magnus plays g4 first. And now white just waits while black improves his knight. Gets to f5. Now he wants to push g3 next. King g2, and now g3. Now if the knight moves, let's say, to f6, there's this check, and after this there's g2. And in case of this, I think this should be winning, because after king g1 there's h4, and slowly but surely he'll advance his pawns, which means that black is winning this one. So he chose to play this, and black plays king h3. There's no other way to make a progress without losing the pawn. And this is the moment where white chose to push the king up, king f4. And here black says, take the knight, I'm gonna push my pawns. If white takes on f5, there's g2. And after one check, there's king g3, one more check, king h2, and after, let's say, knight g5, to somehow fork with knight f3 in case of promotion to have this, and king g4 with the draw. And now black can just calmly play h3 and then promote, because in case of king g4 you would like to have knight f3, but because of rules of chess this is a check and a slight issue for white. So after this, if you give a check, just king f3 and a king g3, and that's game over. h2 comes next. One of these pawns is gonna become a queen. Artemiev chose knight g5, but after king g2, again, if you take on f5, there is h3 and the h-pawn becomes a queen. So he tried to stop the h-pawn by king g4, but now anyways black goes for this endgame, giving up one pawn, but actually with this b pawn being on the board, being very advanced pawn, it's tough to stop it. Knight e3, king h4, and now king h2. Now the knight cannot jump to f4 because of this check and exchanging knights. If knight g5, there's g2. Magnus played this, and now it seems that white is holding this position. Knight on f3 is ready to sacrifice for the pawn on g2 at any moment, but in reality black can just sacrifice his knight for this knight, deflecting this knight on f3. By doing that, he's just going to promote, very simply. After king g3, knight f5 check, king f2, and now knight d4 to get to g1, but after king h2, now the knight cannot move to either f3 or e2. The king has to defend the knight, and this is why Artemiev resigned in this position, because he's either going to exchange knights, which means that the g-pawn is going to promote, or he's going to simply lose the knight because the king has to step away from f2. If you have any questions about the position, about this video, let me know in the comment section and Have a good day and take care.